Response and rebuttal to Jason Kenney, the man who calls himself the Premier of Alberta. He made a statement regarding Pastor Artur, every word of which was a lie. I want to go line by line and show exactly how every statement he made was deceitful. First of all, he's making a statement in a church. How shameful and disrespectful and disgraceful to speak about a pastor who has fed the poor for 20 years in this manner, in a church of all places. Second, his whole press conference was about protecting religious freedoms and places of worship from hate and violence. To that, I have a question. Where were you when our church and ministry was being attacked? Where were you when someone set our house on fire? Where were you when the ministry vehicles and their tires slashed, windows broken, and wheels unscrewed? You, the media, and other politicians have incited hate and violence against my father, Artur, and our family. While we slept, an arsonist tried to set us ablaze, and you did nothing. You said nothing. That is on you. Where were you when our church was vandalized? Where were you when the media lied about us, saying we terrorized the neighborhood, even though it was us who were attacked by acts of hate and violence? You only stood with those churches that support you and bow to your regime. Anyone else receives tyranny. I quote from Jason Kenney's statement. This is a quote after he was asked about Pastor Artur. Quote, "In Canada, we have something called the rule of law, where courts are responsible for adjudicating criminal charges against individuals, not politicians. So we have an independent judiciary." That is a lie. We no longer have an independent judiciary and court system. If the justice system truly was independent, you, Kenney, would have been found guilty for breach of court order under the Rook Order. The rule of law means an equal application of the law and that everyone is subjected to some laws, to the same laws. Kenney has shown that we no longer have the rule of law. In Alberta, there is one law for me and one law for thee. The last 2 years have shown that the courts and judges are far from independent. They are rather political enforcement tools in the hands of the politicians. The rule of law does not exist under Jason Kenney's regime. Let's continue with Kenney's lie-filled statement. Quote, "That individual has been detained by the police because of multiple breaches in terms of release, court orders, as well as an alleged incitement to violence at the Coutts border crossing blockade." End quote. This statement is completely false and, in fact, misinformation. Actually, Artur is detained and charged with mischief over $5,000, aiding and abetting the blocking of critical infrastructure under the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, and allegedly breaching a bail condition for, quote, "not keeping the peace." He's not detained for multiple breaches and or court orders. He's being charged for exercising his free speech and vocally opposing your tyranny. The incitement to violence claim I want to address directly. Jason Kenney, I have a question. I'm not being facetious or humorous. I really need to know. Are you a moron? Seriously, I have to know if I'm dealing with an intellectually handicapped individual. You realize that speech is published and available to the public, for which you claim that he incited violence. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to go slow so that you can catch this. 3 times in that speech, Artur explicitly states, I am not talking about violence. I am talking about peaceful resolution. I am not talking about guns and swords. What kind of brainless individual could interpret that as incitement to violence? Quote from Jason Kenney. That individual has all the rights of any individual under the Canadian legal system. They are presumed guilty, presumed innocent until proven guilty, of course, in our system of law. Was that a Freudian slip? They have a right to access to counsel. That individual or any other individual has all the same legal rights as anybody. End quote. So, actually, Kenny, that individual does not have the same rights of any individual. You arrested him and several other pastors in Alberta for keeping their church open, while you drank whiskey at Sky Palace with your buddies free of legal consequences. Liquor stores, marijuana shops, and Walmarts were allowed to operate, but church was deemed illegal and unessential by you. I have to apologize. That first part of that statement you corrected was indeed true. Artur is presumed guilty, as you have him locked up in solitary confinement for 35 days now, before he has stood trial, had his day in court, or been found guilty. He is not a flight risk and has no criminal record, yet you treat him worse than a violent criminal. In Calgary, a man was found guilty of murder, and yet he was granted bail. The double standard and hypocrisy is clear as day. Artur is right now being presumed guilty, so we no longer have the presumption of innocence in Alberta, thanks to Jason Kenney. Furthermore, Pastor Artur does not have fair access to counsel. The prison has denied visitations and has repeatedly denied the lawyers' phone calls to their client. Artur does not have the same legal rights as everybody else. Under Kenney's regime, Artur has been placed in the worst conditions possible in Canada. A seemingly free and democratic society. A pastor who has not stood trial or been found guilty is still in solitary confinement. Continuing the quote, this is a matter that is before the courts, and as a more general comment, I would suggest that going to a very tense combustible situation and inciting people to be willing to die and commit acts of violence for their cause is very likely to have legal consequences. And I would suggest that nobody is above the law. No politician, no person that calls themselves a pastor is above the law. The rule of law applies equally to everybody in our system of the rule of law. End quote. I want to unpack this narcissistic, untrue, misinformed, hypocritical, full of contempt statement. First off, being willing to lay down your life for a cause that is dear, important, and just in your own eyes is not a call to violence. Being willing to die for a cause such as freedom does not imply violence. Those fighting for freedom during the Solidarity movement in Eastern Europe and the Civil Rights movement in the United States were willing to die for their cause, but fought peacefully. Being willing to die means you are willing to sacrifice and pay a price for the cause of freedom. Because as we have seen, the government punishes and cracks down on dissidents and opposition. Jason Kenney claims that nobody is above the law and that the rule of law applies equally. In that case, I look forward to Kenney turning himself in to the police for breaching a court order. This hypocritical and narcissistic statement will be the nail in the coffin of your political career and reputation. You, Jason Kenney, should be charged for breaching your own mandates, restrictions, and a court order for partying at Sky Palace. The same week you arrested pastors for breaching that court order, you broke it. You should be in solitary confinement beside Pastor Artur. If the law is applied equally and if the rule of law still exists. Jason Kenney protects himself, his regime, and his own. Kenney, do you really Do you really think you can fool the people into believing you, that you stand for religious freedoms and freedoms in general? You reward those that obey your tyrannical, illegal, and unconstitutional mandates. Everyone else, you ticket, harass, defame, attack, arrest, and jail. You have arrested more pastors than Communist China. You will forever be remembered as the man who persecuted, harassed, and imprisoned Christian pastors. The history books will remember you as the worst premier in Canada's history and as the man who persecuted Christians. You have successfully given the title of the most persecuted man in Canada to Pastor Artur. And that will be your legacy. The legacy of a failed premier, a corrupt tyrant, and a deceiving fraud. Thank you. Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art!
Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor Art! Free Pastor